Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mark Stafford. I often describe myself as Zina's alter ego. In fact, we work so closely together that I didn't even bother to place the image of her on the slide of different presenters for today, which hopefully will come back at some point in time. I am still working on it here. I've been working on Microsoft Graph for a number of years, and some of that has been in China, some of that has been in the US, and so I'm pleased to be here with you guys this morning. I do work on the identity side of Graph as opposed to the Office side of Graph. So I work with Dan Kershaw and Jeff Sackowitz, and we work on user and group APIs and so on and so forth. And it looks like this is actually starting to respond again. So give me one more second to see if I can actually get this going again. Are people able to see the screen again?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, we can, Mark.
Okay, I am just not going to touch anything, and I'm just going to actually toggle through the slides manually for right now. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining the community call. Just by way of a quick reminder, the next monthly meeting is May 1st, 2018, and you can pass out the AKAMS Microsoft Graph call. We welcome all comers. And just by way of informal poll, if this is your first time here or you're new to Microsoft Graph, if you don't mind mentioning that in the IM window, that will help us to understand like who are we running into that's brand new. So we have a bit of a standard spiel at the start of the call here, and then we're going to do a deep dive into stuff. But like we really want to know who's new in the community and who's here for the first time. So please do mention that in the IM window if you're here for the first time. We'll touch on today what's new and how you can use Microsoft Graph, and then of course we've got the product teams behind Microsoft Graph. So today we've got Sudhi on the call to talk about the Excel API, and then we've got a couple of guest presenters who are coming in with some technical deep dives, and then as time allows, we'll deal with Q&A at the end. All right, so today's presenters we already covered in large part. Let me just jump forward to that particular slide. As I mentioned, Yina is currently on vacation in a much sunnier part of the world than Seattle. It is cloudy and rainy here, and so she's enjoying her time away. Sudhi's going to present on the Excel APIs, and then we've got Gavin and Barron. Gavin and here too. So just to remind folks about Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is the one endpoint where you can walk up to and get access to everything inside of Microsoft. And increasingly, this is growing larger every single day. One of my main jobs is to run API review for a broad variety of different APIs. And so I was reviewing some APIs in Windows yesterday, and obviously we already have really, really good presence from Azure Active Directory and Office, and we see this list growing literally every single day, and we're looking forward to build in not too long here where we can make a bunch more announcements about the new APIs that are onboarding. But the important part to remember is that Microsoft Graph really is the API where you get access to all of your different user group and organizational data. And you can do that with one user account, whether you're using your AAD user account, your MSA user account. There's just one form of authentication that you need to worry about. Calling the API is really very straightforward. This slide has a pretty nice build to it, but we can't see that right now because I'm not willing to risk any instability on my computer. Really, the API boils down to graph.microsoft.com, adding a version, and then you can start to add other things to that. And so we start with these top-level user concepts like /me or /users or whatever, and then in some cases where that is a collection, you can append a ID to it, and you can even go further to get specific properties. So, for instance, there's the URL in the middle of the screen here that says /users/Yina/department. And this allows you very fine-grained control, and we do our best to make this consistent across the surface of Microsoft Graph. There's also a series of different query parameters that you can use to restrict the things that you get back. So you can ask, for instance, for just the top 5 events on Nina's calendar. Now, I wish that I could make a promise that this was all hunky-dory and consistent across the entire surface of Graph. The reality is that it's very hard to build things that are perfectly consistent because we build things on top of different stores in the background. And so one of the questions that we often get is, how do we know which query string parameters we can use for which particular resources? And I'm glad to say that we're working on some things that hopefully we'll be announcing in the build timeframe that aren't necessarily going to make query parameters suddenly work across everything, but we will be doing a much better job of documenting specifically which query parameters work with which collections. So hopefully that's good news for people. And again, kind of standard slide here. These are some of the common sorts of URLs that you would see inside of Microsoft Graph. So this is really useful for people who are new to Microsoft Graph or maybe watching this video for the first time. /me is really an alias for the currently logged in user, and so a lot of the sample queries that you'll see if you're touching Graph for the first time orient around me. So this first query here just retrieves my profile. It has my first name, my last name. I can ask for a photo by using the third query down there, the me/photo/$value, and all sorts of different data that is about me or my organization. And so some of the things that aren't on here necessarily are my device and so on and so forth. But as we saw in the Graph call, either last month or the previous month, we do have a large footprint there as well with Intune and several other APIs like Project Roam that are onboarding and have to do with devices. So what's new in Microsoft Graph? Well, one of the interesting new things that's happened since the last time we talked is we have released a bunch of new PowerApps templates, 10 of them specifically. These PowerApps templates are downloadable things that you can use pretty much out of the box. In fact, one of the PowerApps templates, the meeting capture one in particular, one of the comments in the blog post was, hey, look, this almost feels like an app that I can pick up and use right away, and it has value. And so I would encourage you to go out and look at the different PowerApps templates that are available. These connect directly to Microsoft Graph and do all their work through Microsoft Graph. And PowerApps, if you're not familiar, is just a really easy way of building applications. It does target a developer persona, but it's not necessarily the same developer persona who would be building a fully custom line of business application, writing, C# and so on and so forth. So I'll share the blog link in a little bit. Again, I don't want to toggle back and forth too much, but there is a blog post that talks about these new templates and their availability. And to make these templates work, we also had to go out and add some different actions for Microsoft Graph connectors. And so these are things that you can also access to help build new Power Apps and so on and so forth. The feedback for this has been really, really positive so far. I would encourage you to go out and evaluate these things for yourself and then provide your own feedback. And then last but not least, for my section, we always want to hear your feedback. In particular, we want to hear about how you use SDKs, what you think of our SDKs. Are we missing SDKs? One of the conversations that I was involved in the other day was around PowerShell and how important it was to have a PowerShell module that can connect up to Microsoft Graph. So you can use this QR code or this short URL to go out and take our Graph SDK Dev survey. Please do that. That is particularly important to us. And I'm going to try to go ahead and copy that into the chat window as well here, just so that you have it readily available and no excuses not to take our survey. Okay, so there's that URL. And with that, I'm going to give up the spotlight and I'm going to go ahead and pass the baton over to Sudhi, who is going to talk about the Excel REST APIs in Microsoft Graph.
Okay, thank you, Mark. My name is Sudhi Ramamurthy. I'm part of the Office Extensibility team, and over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working on enabling Excel APIs. And I just shared my screen, so let me know if you're unable to see. So today, the topic I'm going to go over is Excel APIs through Microsoft Graph. And as Mark had shown in one of the previous slides, there are multiple workloads as part of the Microsoft Graph. And The one interesting one is the Excel REST, which we hope is sort of the first of many document access, rich document access APIs that we're going to enable through the Microsoft Graph. And the way it works is, if you are used to accessing Excel using your client technologies, right, such as VBA or VSTO, so that is more of an in-client experience. So what we have tried to do here is provide a service-based access and allow web and mobile applications to connect with Excel. So I'm going to try to go full screen. So, if you're familiar with the VBA or VSTO or any kind of COM-based solutions, those will continue to work great and we'll continue to support it. But at the same time, we are exploring sort of new avenues through which we can give access to document and Excel in particular. So our goals are to enable developers to build powerful solutions using Excel and multiple other platforms within Microsoft Graph, and help integrate Excel data with Office 365 over the web. So once you start connecting Excel with your other workloads, there's multiple set of opportunities where it opens up many productivity solutions. So we want to enable those through the service-based access. And we also want developers to use more of modern web development tools. So in order to support this, we provide two programming models. One is the add-ins and custom functions. So this is essentially a web application that run inside of Excel application or Canvas. So you develop the add-in or custom function once, and you test, and you can deploy across many of the supported platforms. So this is a benefit over if you had, say, VBA or VSTO solution. It does work on online, it does work on Mac OS and iOS, in addition to Windows. And we also offer corporate and store deployment, so your distribution model becomes much simpler. And we provide a JavaScript library that enables this technology. So this is, imagine you're developing an application, the access point is within the app, so you're inside Excel and you can open things like task panes and ribbon customizations and other UI extensions. So again, for this, the user has to be within the application, inside the application, accessing your extension. The second model that this particular conversation is focused on is the REST APIs. So this allows you to integrate with any Excel file stored in your OneDrive for Business, SharePoint. We're very close in enabling the OneDrive consumer as well. And then just like any other workload that sits behind the common endpoint, this will work seamlessly using the Graph endpoint. So the question then is sort of why integrate with Excel service? So these are some of the scenarios that we've seen our customers carry out. Mainly, using Excel as a store to store and retrieve data offline. That means you don't need the users sitting in front of the computer to access the data. They could be in any other preferred access model. It could be their web or mobile application. And then you can enable these apps to perform remote updates and data sync. So if you have some sort of a source of truth that you and your organization refers to quite a lot, we see things like central financial model, or key data points such as interest rate that drives the rest of the workflow, and you store that within a single endpoint that the end user has easy access to, so you don't need to build any expensive UI interface. So they can, one or two users who have special permission can enter the data or access data within the application, and the rest of the apps have access offline. Excel has a very powerful calculation engine, and what customers do is they set up calculations as part of their template, and then they fill the data and they perform remote calculation. And once the calcs are done, you can get rich set of insights either through tables, charts, or any other visualization that you may have. And this goes in line with generating reports. There's quite a lot of data and formatting APIs that we provide. So this allows you to format your data and then share it across your group. You can do things like forecasting, business modeling, scenario analysis, things that required you to be using Excel. Now we can do it remotely. The other, probably the most popular model is the building workflow. So that means if a workflow either ends or begins with data entry within Excel, then you can customize these workflows by automating either the data entry or the data sync operation. So we also have vendors such as Zapier who provide Excel connectors. So if you have other business apps that you want to connect with, and those workflows are really good options to insert Excel logic as part of your overall business rules. And then also there are new avenues through which Graph is being used. Microsoft Graph is being used, bots, intelligent networks, and you can insert Excel as any form of data consumption or as a source of holding your final state, and then it can serve as just like any other endpoint. So these are all different ways through which we see our customers access. There may be other unique scenarios in your organization. So we do have samples available, so getting started. So this might give you some ideas about how to onboard to Excel and then how to use that in your business environment. So coming to the APIs themselves, the APIs are built on open standard patterns, so REST and JSON-based response and requests. Standard OAuth2 based access tokens are used. It supports both server-based as well as a single-page application, and it once you have the token, that the same one that you are used to getting for, say, OneDrive, the same tokens will work for Excel as well. And we also offer two different states of interaction. One is the persistent state, which is the default, which means any changes you make get saved to the document. And then there's also sort of view mode or non-persistent mode, which means you may want to update, let's say, a range of data and then perform some calculation, but not really affect the state of the workbook, because all you're interested is, if I make these some data entries, what will end up being the final numbers somewhere else in the worksheet or workbook. And then you can kind of enter the non-persistent work mode, and then you can perform all your actions and be rest assured that the file itself is not going to be saved. And then it's designed for sort of easy access. So if you're familiar with VBA, these data access patterns are going to look very, very identical. Things like accessing range values, a formula, a number format, and you can set and read all of this using just a single API call. Now, so I mentioned earlier about the locations from where we support this. So if you can reach a file using the Drive API, if you can reach your Excel file, then you can access Excel API. So this is taken from our documentation. As you can see, it's OneDrive Business, group sites, SharePoint sites. So if you have a file in any of these locations and you can access through Drive API, all you need to do is attach or append /workbook at the end of the path, and then you get access to all Excel object model. In this example here down below, I'm using workbook worksheets. So that means give me a collection of worksheets. And here are some of the sample calls before I show in real. And I put these kind of to highlight some unique aspects about the API themselves. So the first one is a create session. So this doesn't affect your data itself. The create session is not to access data or write any data back to the file. This is just to open the workbook in memory. And this is how Excel servers will know that, okay, there is a request coming in, and I'm going to load the file into the memory and then perform calculation as the data updates happen. So this is really important because if you don't use the session in the follow-up requests, each time the copy of this file may need to be loaded up, or Excel performs quite a heavy set of calculation to identify, hey, where is that in-memory copy, and try to attach that. So instead, what we offer is to an API to say, I want a session, I want to persist all the changes I'm going to make, and then you get an ID back and you attach that as a header. So this is something unique about Excel. It's not a common pattern you see in across other Excel, Microsoft, other Microsoft Graph workloads. So this is just a header. Once you attach it, you can just kind of keep the session alive by making multiple access, or just renew the session. And then here I'm using that. I'm getting worksheets, collection of worksheets. And the last example here is Excel has a whole range of what are known as worksheet functions. So these are sort of generic, sort of financial, mathematical calculation functions. And those tend to be really useful when either you want to act on a particular set of data that's on the workbook, or even if you don't have any data at all, but in this case, I'm trying to calculate the monthly payment with interest rate, number of payments left, and the present value, and it comes back with a value. So here, I'm just using the workbook function as a standalone resource, and I'm accessing, giving inputs, and getting data out. So those are sort of different types of API calls. And now I'm going to switch to sort of more hands-on place where you can explore. And then the first place I always go to, whether I'm exploring Excel or any other Microsoft Graph workload, is to go to the website, and then there is a Graph Explorer. And this is a tool for you to learn and engage and explore different workloads. And one of the categories is Excel. So if you enable, it gives you some basic samples and you can play around with. And the only thing you would need to do is, once you sign in, provide your path of the location. So in my case, I have a drive, my OneDrive for Business. On the root, I have let's say a file called book1, and then I'm going to access, hopefully there's a sheet 1 in this workbook, and I'm going to get the use range. And when I run the query, oops, forgot the semicolon.
Sudhi, it looks like you're not signed in.
Yeah, I just realized. It kicks me out after a few minutes. All right. So I was looking at, let's say, use range within a worksheet. Hopefully that'll come up. All right. So this is just an example, and you can kind of begin your exploration and learn along the way. And I just wanted to show another simple web application. It's just running on my local machine, and it allows me to see my contacts and then export the contacts to an Excel workbook. And so I begin with a login. Nothing special here. I'm just gonna sign in, and then it says, okay, I'm signed in. I want to see my contacts. So it's gonna go through the Outlook Contacts API and bring me a list of contacts that I have. Now let's say I want to export this to my OneDrive. So the way it works is, so there is an export option. So when I click this, all the contacts information that I see here is going to get exported to a file that's noted here. And if the file already exists, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to create a new worksheet and upload the contacts in a new worksheet. Now, there is no API to create a new workbook or an Excel file. We are working on that. So what you can do is you can reuse an existing file, or you can have a template file and you can use that as a starter. You can use Drive API to upload it. In this particular sample, I'm using like a base64 version of an empty Excel file, and I upload that and then start interacting with it. So the file itself is on my OneDrive. So this file is already out there and it's created. If it doesn't exist, the sample will create that. As you can see, there are 3 worksheets. So now I'm going to say, okay, export this data, and it's processing, and it's going to export the data to the Excel file. And hopefully I should see another tab, another worksheet with the data that I just created. So as you can see, there's a sheet 4. And I'm going to just walk you through these simple steps of how this happened. So it exported the data and created a table on top of it. And I'm going to switch to the JavaScript code. So this is handcrafted, but there are also SDKs available, so you can use that as well. And I'm just using React and JavaScript APIs to interact with Excel. So the first step is to create persistent session, and you use the workbook create session segments. And I'm saying I want the persistent session. So you get the session token, or sorry, the workbook session ID, and I attach that as part of my request headers on the follow-up request. Next, I create a new worksheet on the workbook. So I post 2 worksheets, and I say, and I leave the body alone. It creates a default worksheet for me. And then I create a table. I don't update the range yet, so I create a table on the newly created worksheet. I access tables collection, and there's an add method. And then once that is done, I begin adding rows at the end of the table. So index of -1 says whatever is at the end, just go ahead and add that. Now contacts is just a list of 2-dimensional array that I've read before from another API, and then it just takes that as a values parameter, and then it appends the rows at the end. So as you can see, it's a fairly simple interaction model. If you begin to use it, it'll very much feel like you're accessing this in a, say, VBA console. It's very much, it kind of uses the same naming convention. The object model looks very much identical if you're an Excel developer. And then you can also at the end close your session. There's also an API to refresh the session. So that's just a simple interaction model to kind of spark an idea of how we can extend. But there are many innovative ways through which we are seeing Excel being used. And in the last couple of minutes, I'll show something that you may have seen in prior conferences, the Excel bot. And this bot has been trained to interact with an Excel document. It's at aka/ms Excel bot. So I go in there, I start chatting with this. So you can think of, say, someone like a salesperson who's on the mobile app, doesn't really want to open a large worksheet and kind of manipulate small cells in a small form factor. And if their work is fairly designed to follow a certain path, you can give them such an interface. It's more interactive, And here I can say work with a file that I have on my OneDrive. It's called loan calculator, so it's a template. And all this allows me to do is to set up my payment schedule and interest rate and kind of play around with it. Imagine I'm talking to a customer, exploring options, sitting across the table. You don't really need any application other than just the simple chat to kind of explore options. So I can say work with loan calc, and it's going to open that in memory. I think in this case it's probably already open. And then it's going to say I'm ready to work with this. So I can say, hey, show me the named items. The named items are markers within Excel that you can reference instead of referencing the range address directly. So here, let's say I have let's look at show monthly payment. It's going to come up with an amount. I'll also look at, hey, what is my interest rate? Going to give me a rate, and let's say, hey, what happens if I set the interest rate a little bit lower? So I can say set. So all it's doing is behind the scene, it's making REST API calls, taking these information and translating it to just range patch operation. So now that the interest rate is set to a somewhat lower amount, I can say, hey, now what is my monthly payment going to be? So obviously it's reduced. So this is a very simple access pattern, but it's very powerful because you can keep all your business logic centrally within your workbook and give your end users many different forms and access to interact with the document. So those are some of very high-level access patterns. There's tons of documentation on our website. There are prior conference video calls where we describe some other application development. And there is a starter kit for regular JavaScript, Angular and React-based web apps. And there's also SDKs, and then some customer stories that you can go see on the Microsoft Graph site. So I think that gives hopefully a broad overview. Reach out to us if you have any questions.
Thank you, Sudhi. And if you do have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat window, and we will try to address those as time goes. But I do want to pass the baton over to Gavin. Gavin works for Intergen and is a pretty well-known SharePoint MVP. Fortunately, he's here in the Seattle area as opposed to New Zealand, where Intergen is based, because it's like 3:30 a.m. there. And so, Gavin, do you want to take over the screen sharing? Do you want me to share?
Yeah, I'll take over the screen sharing.
All right, great.
Let's see. All right, so I want to show everyone a cool way you can use the graph to make your bots a little more useful. The scenario is basically, I really hate getting double booked for meetings or not having enough time to travel to a meeting. I work in a consulting agency. Often I'll have salespeople throwing sales meetings on my calendar that take me half an hour to get to. But if I don't have that half hour booked out, someone will try and book a meeting that I just can't go to. Because they'll say, you're open, I can book with you. No. So I wanted to automate this as much as possible because I'm lazy. No, I'm not lazy. I'm an efficient developer. So what I want to do is use a bot to add some travel time before and after meetings and add as much as I want to add. My bot in this case is configured to, it uses a queue-based pattern to pass messages between the bot and Azure Functions. So at a high level, the bot talks to the user, puts a message on an Azure queue, an Azure function, hey, that build doesn't work right. An Azure function picks it up, communicates with the graph, gets some information back, and then sends it back to the bot via the direct line APIs. Let's take a look at this thing in action though, because demos are much more interesting than looking at slides as far as I'm concerned. All right, let's just get a new conversation going with my bot here. My bot helps me sign in. This is using a library called botauth at the moment. And what it's done in the background there is signed me in, registered a webhook using Azure Functions. So what happened in the background there was a message got dropped onto a queue for the register calendar webhook Azure function. Let me just pull up that code in here and this guy. Zoom that in a little bit and close this and this. So all this function does is pick up a message off the queue and drop a message onto another queue. Makes a call to the graph, to the subscriptions endpoint with a post, posting this little message that says, hey, I want to listen to the me events endpoint for created events. And I'm going to set an expiration time on this. And it just uses standard HTTP call to put that onto, make that request of the graph. From there, the graph makes a call back to the webhook that I've told it wants to listen. It passes a validation token on the query, and we have to respond with a 200 with that validation query token in the body. We have to do that within a certain number of milliseconds. I can't remember what it is, but it's sub-second, I think. But it's quick anyway. Otherwise, that attempt to register will fail. Now, get messages in or meeting requests added to my calendar. This webhook is going to get called, and the rest of the code below here is going to be executed. So, using another identity, let's create a new meeting request for me. Let's have a very important meeting. Caps lock. Super important. We should have it at the pub. We'll be there for a few hours. Better invite myself. Okay. I'm going to hit send. And that meeting request is going to travel through the internet over to my Azure Functions. And eventually, after some time, we'll get a prompt via the bot. Let's take a quick look at what happens as that's taking some time to, hey, actually, I've just been, here's my message. You know, it's telling me all I need to know about the meeting. Admittedly, the formatting of the time could be a little bit better. Do I want to accept? Do I want to go to Flatstick for a very important meeting on Saturday? Yes, I do. Okay. Do I want to book some travel? Yeah, I need a bit of time to get there. I will just choose to book 15 minutes here. because that's all it takes to get down there from my home, thankfully. Okay, so my bot's telling me it's going to book some travel time for me. If we flip back to you can see that I have accepted this very important meeting, which helpfully says that it was accepted via the travel time bot. And if we jump to Outlook, we can see that I have a very important meeting happening on the Saturday with two 15-minute blocks of travel time either side. I built this for my purposes because it just helps me be better at managing my calendar and not frustrating people. But I do plan to open source all of the functions that make this thing work. Let's take a quick look at what happens when we actually get those messages for those webhooks coming in. First thing I do is actually take the message and grab all of the notifications that are within that and drop them onto a message queue. This is just so I can process each individual message at a time. That is dropped onto another web queue, which is watched by yet another Azure function, the process calendar event notification. This does a little bit of magic to look up some access tokens out of DocumentDB, which I'm using as a data store between both the bot and my Azure functions, and creates a little message that gets sent back to the bot. When the bot receives this message, it walks me through that dialogue to elicit input and explain what's going on with this message before making two more calls back to Azure Functions by dropping messages on queues again. First one is the accept. Simplest call in the world. All we need to do is say, hey, all we need to do is call it an accept with a response true or false. The comment is completely optional. It's just a simple post to the address of the meeting that I received via that webhook with my access token and the data that I've created above. The other call is the create travel booking call. Again, really simple. We do a little bit of math to work out how long this meeting needs to be based on the start time and the duration, and post it off to the events endpoint with this little meeting object that says, hey, what's the subject? When does it start? When does it end? That's all we need to say. It's really quite simple. You don't need to worry about all this code too much because I'm going to make it all available for you via an initiative that's been kicked up by the community. I hope you found that useful. And I'm going to throw it over to AC.
Yeah, if only we had such an initiative. So Andrew, you want me to share the screen, correct?
Yeah, if you want to just go ahead and show the slides, assuming you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool.
You give me 1 second here, and I will share my deck.
Sure. While that's getting set up, everyone, I'll post a link into the chat and just let you know that I'm going to be my quote unquote demo is or my presentation here is going to be pretty quick. As I really only have one slide, it's more of a little bit of news. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I've just got a little bit of news here for everyone. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and post them to the chat, and I can answer them really quick afterwards because I don't have a whole lot to say here. So in the last call that we did back in April, I guess introduce myself. My name is Andrew Connell. I'm a SharePoint developer for many, many years. Love the Microsoft Graph. And I guess my only frustration with the Graph is that everything isn't in there yet. I love what they've done with this, so it's always fun to see how much stuff that they add and everything. So big supporter of the Graph. But when the last call that we had, the last monthly call that we had, I believe it was around the time of the MVP summit, and a handful of us were in the same room doing a couple demos, and someone in the room, and I forget who it was, but someone in the room on the call was asking Yina about where we can put samples that they are working on, that they've worked on, and they want to be able to share with everyone. And what we did, one of the things that Yina brought up during the call was that we'd set up a repo for a sample that you had. We put it inside the Microsoft Graph GitHub organization for everybody to take a look at your sample. And I mean, that was going to work great, but after the call concluded, I pulled Yina aside and I talked to her for a few minutes and shared with her what we do over in the SharePoint world, where the SharePoint Patterns and Practices group has 2 repositories. One is specific to web parts, one is specific to extensions. I guess both of them are specific to the extensibility model of the SharePoint framework. And it's a place, it's kind of like a catch-all. It's one place where anybody can submit contributions, anybody can submit samples, tutorials, etc. So in the spirit of that, I worked with Yina to stand up a new repository in the Microsoft Graph GitHub organization. So if you just go to github.com/Microsoft Graph /msgraph-community-samples. What this is if you're familiar with the SharePoint framework, web parts and extensions samples, you're going to be really familiar with this because it's basically set up the exact same way. In fact, we made some tweaks to the Graph one, and I submitted some PRs back for documentation updates to the SharePoint framework guys. But what this is it shows you all the details over there in the little screenshot there. And instead of just clicking through a website, I'll just stay on the slide for a bit. But what the deal is that if you look at the documentation inside this repo, it walks you through how to contribute, how to add your own sample. But the process is very straightforward. It's the same way that we do all other kinds of open source based contributions. Go to this repository, fork the repository. You create a branch in your local fork, add your sample to the repository. You'll see if you go into the samples folder, you'll see each sample gets its own folder, and there's a bit of a naming convention that's used for the folder name. So if you would, try and stick with that. And then the README for inside the samples folder has an index of all the samples that are there. Now, today, we went live with this yesterday. But the way it's set up right now is that effectively all of the samples that you see there right now are really just cross-reference entries to existing samples that the Microsoft Graph GitHub organization has as self-standing repositories. So we didn't want to remove all the existing repos. We didn't want to copy stuff to have 2 different locations. Instead, this just kind of serves right now as a table of contents or an index to all the other samples. So if you dig into one of the samples, you'll see where it actually points to the actual repo of a different sample. Hey, feel free to put your code in this sample and to see into a new folder to submit a sample. If you want to, if you have a sample like in your own repo that you want to be able to cross-reference it, that's something that we can explore doing. Right now, it really should be stuff that's inside of this repo. There's just a couple things you need to keep in mind. Make sure, once you've created this, once you've gone through and added your stuff to your fork, you're then going to submit a pull request back to this repository. And once every week, once every 2 weeks, I'm going to work with the Graph guys. Part of my contribution to the community is going to be to review the PRs that are submitted and to merge them into the rest of the repository. The only reason why you have somebody that's kind of looking at this and it's not just an automatic merge going in is because we don't want one person's contributions clobbering someone else's. We also, things like you don't need to have 50 different instances of an Angular implementation of a Graph to-do app. So That's all that is. You'll also see when you create a new sample where there's a README document for what you can use as far as a template. So you list out the technologies that you use. You list out the different graph technologies you use. So for example, the one that Gavin just presented, maybe the technologies he would reference are things like the MSAL for authentication, maybe the V2 endpoints for Azure AD, maybe the bot framework, Azure function. And the graph technology that he would have focused on is whatever tech he decided to use for the SDK. So maybe he used the REST API, or maybe he used the .NET SDK. It really depends. But the idea there is just to give people a really quick and easy way to find this stuff. The one thing that I will throw out there that you need to be careful of is including code or copies of code from third-party libraries. So like, for example, Microsoft has got a big legal arm, and we need to be very careful and very aware of the fact that that this repository should not be redistributing other libraries that are out there that have different licenses. For example, even something as inane as, oh, I'm just referencing jQuery. That's fine if you reference it. That's fine if it's something that is included, like if it's a .NET project, included in the packages.config, or if it's a Node project or a client-side project, you include it in the packages.json. Just don't include the actual libraries in there. Those are things that we just need to make sure we don't create copies of third-party code inside this repo. That's one of the things that I'm looking at when people submit PRs. Only reason a PR would get rejected or get asked you to fix it is that if it's creating conflicts that you need to resolve, stuff like that. But all the docs and everything are in there in the repository. Feel free to take a look at this. Feel free to kick the tires, clone it. Great place for a one-stop shop for community contributions around the Microsoft Graph.
Thank you. So, I mean, just on behalf of Microsoft, like I am just so incredibly stoked to see stuff like this taking off, right? Like any job, I mean, there's good days and bad days, and it's contributions like this and just the myriad of different blog posts that we see that really keep us going on a day-to-day basis. So we really appreciate the community that exists around us, and just always want to take time to recognize the people who are contributing to the community. So again, thank you for the community samples. We look forward to what's going to happen there. Thank you, of course, to people who are authoring all the different blog posts, and I saw a couple mentioned in the IM chat as well. So we just really appreciate you guys, and let us know how we can keep moving things forward as well. So just some kind of final wrap up, and then we'll address one or two questions if we have a couple of minutes left. The recording will be uploaded to the Office Developer YouTube soon. Again, the next call is May 1st, 2018. And you can submit your questions now or put it on your calendar with the two AKAMS URLs there. With that, let's turn over to Q&A. I've got a couple questions that were submitted via email, and so maybe we'll address one or two of those if there's nothing else urgent, and I don't see anything else huge in the chat window right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just try to address one or two calls, or one or two questions that came in via email. Sorry, I'm switching over to that email. Okay, so the first question, actually, I'm going to farm out. The first question was, do you plan to make it possible to filter users based on open type extensions, just like it works with messages, events, etc.? Dan, are you still on?
I am indeed.
Go for it. Take it away.
So currently, it is not in our plans to filter on open type extensions for users or any directory objects at the moment. It is something we could do, but it would be a little bit challenging, mainly because when you filter, because we're storing the extension data outside of the directory, we would have to honor filters across the multiple data sets and support paging and so forth. So it actually starts to become a pretty difficult thing to accomplish. So we could do something that as today allows you to filter on properties that are mastered within, for example, Azure Active Directory, and also get the extension properties in the response as well. But if you wanted to, for example, try and filter on the value of an extension property and also values that are in Azure Active Directory and then page the results back, that would be a tough challenge for us. So it would be great to hear a little bit more on the kind of scenarios that you're after. Our general answer on this is if you want to use filtering against directory, then please use schema extensions rather than open extensions.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm going to take one more and then say thank you and send you on your way. So what is the size limit on the email attachment using Graph SDK for .NET? So currently, Graph itself has an upload limit in general that gets imposed, and that upload limit is 4 megabytes. Now, there's a couple things that we've been talking about. Number one, like that limitation was due to some really early bits that we had, and we don't believe that we need to worry about that anymore. So we'll probably remove that limitation in Graph itself. But even apart from that, just the idea of uploading large files, we already have a pattern inside of Graph with the OneDrive API that we try to make Graph as consistent as possible. So once you learn one part of Graph, then you can go pick up other parts of Graph pretty easily. And so the resumable upload pattern that OneDrive has pioneered and the ability to chunk that upload into different pieces is a really appealing pattern, seems to work well, and so we'll probably follow that same pattern. This is one of the things that we're currently discussing with Outlook, and that is likely to land sometime in the near future. So even though it's 4 megabytes today, we do plan to raise that limitation in the foreseeable future. There's one more question that came in as far as Microsoft Graph issues. We are right up against 9 o'clock. We'll take a look at that issue and try to reply back on GitHub. And there were several other questions that came in. I'm going to keep a list of those, and we will figure out how to either respond asynchronously or on the next community call. But again, thank you guys so much for your time. We recognize that this is an hour that you have to invest, and we really, really appreciate your time. Thanks.